Our session, ladies and gentlemen, is about boards and CEOs, who wears the pants. The relationship between the board and the management ought to be one of constructive tension, and who provides the leadership and who really wears the pants is what is going to be discussed. And we have with us Mr. Subodh Bhargav, who is active in the field of education, especially technical and management education. He also serves on the boards of directors of several companies. He's been the former chairman of Tata Communications, GSK Consumer Health, and TRF, as well as the former group chairman and CEO of Aisha. Mr. Bhargav has been associated with various state governments, including as a member of the Insurance Tariff Advisory Committee. Mr. Leo Puri is the former managing director of UTI Asset Management and former chairman of the Association of Mutual Funds of India. He's worked as director and senior advisor with McKinsey & Company and as managing director with Warburg Pincus, and has extensive experience of leading strategy and transformation engagements in the context of economic reforms and deregulation in some of the longest public and private sector financial institutions in India. Mr. Puri will also moderate this session. Mr. Rusto Ravanan is the co-founder, MD, and CEO of Mindtree and responsible for strategic direction and achieving industry-leading growth for the company. He's held several roles in the company before heading the Enterprise Service Lines Group. Earlier, he had been the CFO and had led the initial public offering, which was amongst the most successful IPOs of the year. Mr. Ravanan has been active in various industry forums and in the company's effort to become a socially responsible corporation. So it's over to you, Mr. Puri, to moderate the session and start it off.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you, and welcome to my fellow panelists. So we will roughly use about 20 to 25 minutes or so to have some comments from the three of us, and then really would like to very quickly open it up to you for questions. So I'll just introduce the topic and provide a framework before turning to Rosso and Subodh to comment. This topic, the notion as to whether it's the board or the CEO that calls the shots, I think in the Indian context, you have to understand how we've actually evolved. Broadly, there have been two competing models in Indian sort of corporate development. One was broadly the British model, if you like, which clearly has always tried to push listed companies towards an independent chair with well-defined responsibilities that would govern the board, and a CEO that would actually run the company. And the other was more the American model, which gelled somewhat better with the initial entrepreneurial development of Indian companies, where you essentially had an integrated view on running the board and the company, and really running the board was an extension of running the company. And these have been two competing models, and I think before one reaches judgment on rights versus wrongs, and you need to have some evolutionary understanding of where we've come from. Today, clearly, we are moving much more, I would say, from a regulatory and a top-down perspective towards the British model, the Cadbury model, if you like, of governance, where the roles of the board must be more sharply delineated to be complementary but yet distinct from that of management. But our organic impulses are still towards the old model, and I think that's where you see a lot of the transition that is actually happening in India. The second observation I'd make is that if you look at how corporate governance has actually developed in the best Indian companies, it's actually effectively the CEOs who have set the tone. Why is that? Because typically we have not yet had a culture of strong, independent, non-executive chairmen. If you were to ask yourself, and you can ask yourself this question mentally, and I'd be happy to hear your questions on it later. Who are the real role models in India of successful, independent, non-executive chairmen? How many do we have that you could actually say could have taken the true responsibility for leading a board and leading the management of a company in a board-driven company? And I honestly think the answer to that is we are still developing that type of person who could actually be distinct from the CEO and yet be respected enough, knowledgeable enough, and committed enough to the company's interests to actually operate as an independent, non-executive chair. Many of the people we have in that role are actually either former CEOs or not very independent, or indeed not very well competent or qualified because they're there by virtue of a policing role. And as we heard in the plenary, the role of boards is not just to police, it's also to add value to the company. So I think the way we're going here is that we need to first develop a cadre of people and role models who could be effective independent chairmen of boards, at which point the boards become ready to actually take the responsibility that is entrusted to them in the Companies Act. And the tension, if you like, that is perceived between dominant CEOs trying to control a board versus a board that is working in complementary fashion with the CEO will get somewhat diminished. So that's the context that's evolving. But I'd request Subodh to share his perspectives on how he sees that evolution progressing. Is there broadly good news for India's governance here, or are we in trouble?
Well, let me first say that between the board and the CEO, to my mind, neither of them wear the pants. Secondly, I would say there is no fit-all structure or constitution which will encompass all the corporates at different times also. If at all anyone wears the pants, I think in India, in Indian context, is the owner, the promoter. The boards are driven by him, the CEOs are driven by him, and I think the board functioning is entirely dependent on what the promoters expect, whether it's the public sector, the government as the owner, the multinationals. They look at a passive board, which is certifying board. There are promoters, owners who would want the board to be intervening or engaged board. There are some who would be interfering boards. In my view, that even in a same corporate, same entity, at different times, the equation between the board and the CEO keeps changing, depending on, number one, the economic environment in respect of especially the domain in which that company is working. The experience, at least my own, is that when the things are not going well, or when there's loss of market share or some threats, the CEO looks towards board and its shoulder to take the responsibility. On the other hand, a conscious board would also want to interfere with more guidance, including in some operational areas. So that's the reality. And on top of that, when I talk about turf is equally important. To my mind, between the board and the CEO, there's a very clear-cut turf. If the board starts creating a strategy, obviously we are crossing our line. And if we are going into operations, we are making a mistake. I think the role of the board ultimately is to challenge and inquire the management in every respect, work towards empowering the CEO to make him more effective, but not let him become all-powerful, so that the conflict thereafter becomes very difficult. And a board, depending on its constitution, the diversity, the experience, the expertise it brings, to my mind, is very capable of finding that balance where they do add value, in addition to challenging and creating that conscience which is required in good governance and taking the company forward. May I leave it there?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very clear. I mean, also, you've been a founder and a CEO, which is also interesting. And I mean, how do you see the role of the board in a founder-driven organization, as it were?
Thank you, Mr. Puri, and thank you to Mr. Damodaran for having all of us over. I think the success of this event shows that you need larger hall next year. This, almost getting to be only standing room left at the end of the hall there. But maybe I'll start on a slight, strictly sort of lighter vein. I have two issues with the title. One is somehow it seems to imply that men wear the pants, and somehow it also seems to imply that the person who wears the pant somehow seems to be having a little bit of higher control, and I'm sure neither of those are true. Just look at all the women in this room. There are a lot of women wearing pants, and not necessarily always those who wear the pants get to call the shots there. But on a more serious note, I think implying that there is some kind of a controversy or some kind of a difference of opinion over who owns governance between the CEO and the board, I think is fundamentally a misplaced question. This is like saying, should a father or the mother take more responsibility for bringing up a child? Both are actually equally invested. So the question of running a company with good governance is equally the responsibility for both the board and the CEO, in my view. Maybe this delimitation or segregation of roles and responsibilities in some ways to make it practical, because everybody's business usually then becomes nobody's business. Therefore, maybe the right way to look at it is boards are responsible for certain things like setting the right processes, taking responsibility for a few things like that, whereas the CEO is responsible for a few things, like, for example, running the company in line with the policies and processes laid down by the board, and also the obligation to go back to the board, exercising fair judgment when something happens which gives a cause for concern or some kind of a doubt, etc. The last point that I wanted to leave the audience with is, over the last few years, I think the whole discourse on governance has somehow ended up being only a financial propriety, fraud, and those kind of dimensions, and or at best the legal compliance, those kind of dimensions as well. If we were to just expand that definition a little bit, and we don't need to look at anything other than, at least since I come from an industry where all our assets are always measured by the people that we have, the talent that we have, we don't need to look any further from the recent events at Google, where things happened and the talent at Google did not like the way they were handled, and there was a mass protest, etc., that led Google to change some of its policies, change some of its practices, and so on and so forth. So I think the question of governance needs to go beyond just the financial, regulatory kind of aspects and start looking at governance, because I think talent, which is going to be such a critical resource for every industry, will also want to work in companies with good governance. So it goes beyond just the financial or the regulatory aspects.
Well, no, that's a fair perspective. But suppose if I may ask you, you say that, they both are equally important, and the promoter often calls the shots. But if you look at the structure and direction that our Companies Act and the corporate regulation is taking in India, clearly the expectation is that the role of promoters must change now, moving forward for listed companies, given that the interests of minority shareholders must be protected. And that's forcing promoters to rethink, therefore, the role that they may want to play, and therefore how they may want to participate in board processes. So, for example, this future separation of chairman and CEO, and indeed the fact that even being related might be a problem. This is going to actually expose some fault lines. And I wonder how you see the readiness or preparedness for that environment, where you will, as a promoter, have to really decide, do you want to be the custodian of the board and run those processes, or do you want to, as it were, abdicate that in a sense and trust an independent chair or independent chair to do that for you and commit yourself to building shareholder value as a CEO?
Let me come point by. I think firstly, separation of the chairman and CEO, to my mind, is in the right direction. Okay. Because CEO needs some supervision, some guidance beyond a committee called NRC or XYZ, or even the board. It's a 10 or 9 people board, can't really add that much value to the CEO as the chairman can. The question of being related or not related is debatable, but I think in Indian context, where family-owned companies promoted, delivering greater value than the otherwise, I see no reason why the relationship of patriarch remaining a non-executive chairman, guiding the youngster who are now holding the fort, should be denied. To my mind, perhaps we will be moving at least in the next decade or two in the wrong direction. We need some more time to evolve that scenario. Second, in terms of the promoter staying away as long as he's active, competent, capable, and today those days have gone where just because you were the son of the promoter, you became chairman or CEO. I think things are changing. The promoters are certainly making sure that the young generation is adequately trained, educated, and therefore to sort of divest the promoters from the board or the CEO role is different. Promoter CEO perhaps wear the pants because he's got both into it, whether it's the patriarch's son or daughter or whatever it may be. So going forward, I think the boards will get a greater responsibility as the promoters generate confidence in the boards. I just want to make one maybe slight different point which has been in the morning also, and also perhaps you alluded. When a company is in trouble, everybody talks about the board and the independent directors, the media give it the highest visibility. But when the company has done well, there's not a single story talking about the contribution of the board and the independent directors in that story. Not a single story. Media doesn't like it. I don't think people want to read about it. So I would say that to create a more effective board role, and as I said, board has a different role than the operating CEO, and to take that forward, I think we need to create much more sort of visibility or stories about how boards have enabled the company to avoid a crisis or take it on the upside, and the contribution of the directors, whether it is non-executive or independent or both.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think, again, I'd like to hear both your thoughts on the other issue which I mentioned, which is that for boards to evolve and successfully play their role, you do need the figure of an independent, non-executive chairman to develop. And that's still something which is, in my mind, a work in progress in India. If you look at the rest of the world, where have they found such an animal? Where it's typically, not surprisingly, former CEOs who essentially have made that transition and usually make that transition successfully, but to other companies. In India, we've had the phenomenon where former CEOs have transitioned to being chair of their own companies.
That's right.
Which is a debatable proposition as to whether that will then meet the test. It has happened, and again, I know you yourself have some direct experience of that, but it has happened partly because of a perceived lack of talent, if you like, and partly because we fundamentally trust these have been very good people who have a record of building shareholder value. And in a way, it's not been a bad thing, because if you look at the record of people who have played that role, transitioned in that way, whether it's been an A.M. Nayak or a Deepak Parekh or a K.V. Kamath, and I'm using names to illustrate the power of the concept. Typically, these have been people who have, of course, already earned the trust of institutional investors. And now if I wear my hat as a one-time institutional investor, frankly, we quite like that model. Why did we like that model? Because it meant the fellow who had created the wealth for you in the first place was still in charge. But from a corporate governance point of view and from the whole sort of architecture of governance, it raises questions that if the only way you're going to get non-executive chairman is to actually take the CEO and place him there and let his successor, poor fellow, have to deal with a board which is dominated by his predecessor, you are always going to get questions around how governance sort of evolves. But where is the solution?
If I may say that you didn't take the name of Rahul Bajaj.
Rahul Bajaj.
Non-executive chairman, whether promoter or CEO, cannot remain non-executive. I think there's just too much backseat driving or even front coming on from time to time, which is disastrous for the company. If you have been there as a CEO, step back, don't appear anywhere on the board even. In fact, my own experience, I tell you, in Aisha, I stepped down at the age of 58, and I never visited the office. I never got connected with the board in any manner. And I think I have Mr. Sandelia here, who did a perhaps much better job than I did during my period because he had the space. He could take it forward. Similarly, I think for the non-executive chairman, we have a problem of too much talk but very little action. We keep on saying independent directors, talent is not available. I have suggested at various platforms, and I again would like to repeat, that we need to adopt that Cadbury formula, where they created a group of 12, 14 companies from different domains, and not the CEOs only, but the vertical heads, SBU heads, were exchanged on different boards to bring experience, to be current on their knowledge. We are not doing that. Our corporates and our promoters or boards do not allow their senior executive to go on another board. I had to fight on 2 boards to get the CEO because the promoters will not allow him to join another board as an independent director. I think that is where we need to expose the SBU and BU heads, functional heads who do not become CEOs, to become independent directors, grow into that, and they would be available for going as non-executive independent chairman on the boards. Once again, with all modesty apart, I did that. From Aisha, I went to Tata Communications, few others, non-executive independent. And I think it's a role which can add a lot of value for the company on which you are, in terms of brand, reputation, strategy, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's possible. That's all what I'm saying.
I would personally underline that point, actually. The day when you see the best corporate leaders being able to step out of their familiar domains and use their talents in completely unrelated ways, as opposed to either being held on to or holding on to.
No, being held on to is not there. I hold on. There's nobody saying being held on.
You are far more
nobody
direct
pushes
on that.
to.
Yes, so, and you know, because you can see the power that would unlock. And frankly, as you say, some of our promoters could be fabulous non-executive chairmen, given their entrepreneurial knowledge of other companies,
yes, exactly.
unrelated to the businesses they set up. They could be terrific mentors and leaders, and frankly lead boards better than most people. So I would ask you on the point, you know, founder-driven companies, I'll let you make your other comment as well, but there's a tremendous a lack of confidence in many of our new generation companies in terms of the quality of governance. We've seen that they're very exciting companies, but the majority of their board processes and leadership is under serious challenge and scrutiny. Again, I'd like your thoughts on that. You've, of course, matured beyond that, but you are a founder. And please feel free to be as frank as you'd like on how that's going to evolve.
Maybe one comment on the previous thread of discussion, and then I'll come back to your question, Mr. Puri. Somehow I'm not sure if we are trying to form one formula that applies to a really wide spectrum of real life examples. And I'll maybe take 2 things to illustrate what I'm trying to say. I am a founder, extremely proud of my journey as an entrepreneur, but I don't think we fall into one definition that seems to be the common perception of a promoter. For example, I don't even have a designated parking space in my office. The entire parking lot is open. Whoever comes first parks whenever they can, find a parking space and go back there. So it is not as though all promoters have some kind of walk 3 feet above the ground and have that kind of a perception, or try to do things that are not in line with governance or anything like that there. And at least, like I said, speaking out of my limited experience, many people in my industry all have the similar approach. So we don't, in that sense, behave like the version of the promoter that seems to be the common perception there. And secondly, at least speaking out of my own personal experience, our previous CEO, KK, has now become the chairman. And I can't believe what would have, the kind of things that we are going through as an industry and as an organization. I don't think I can be as effective in my role if I did not have that hand on my shoulder, that support, that wisdom. And also all the practical stuff. For example, in our industry, travel is an inevitable part of our day-to-day job. There are times there's one customer in Bangalore and another customer in New York. It is because I have KK, then one of us can do one customer and the other can do the other. There is all that past track record and all that past knowledge and everything else that KK has. So I actually feel it's extremely blessed for me to have the previous CEO as the current chairman, have that continuity, have that comfort to customers, comfort to talent.
But supposing you had Nandan Nilekani as your chairman, would you have been any less well served?
No, I don't know. I never worked under Nandan and I don't work at Infosys, so therefore that question you have to ask Salil or you have to ask somebody else there. But I'm just saying in our experience, I'm not sure, my only limited point was to say, if you apply one formula across all companies, given the diversity in industries, given the diversity in the business rhythms of those industries, etc., I'm not sure if one formula works to say black and white, previous chairman can be CEO, can't be CEO, CEO and chairman have to be unrelated and so on and so forth. I think it's so specific to each company and each context there. Coming to the question that you posed to me, our industry, I think it came up in the previous discussion as well on whether Elon Musk was right or wrong when he smoked pot on a radio show and so on and so forth there. But one thing that's common for our entire industry and especially for all the quote-unquote new age businesses is that they are started with really wild ideas by people who dare to dream a completely different world than the reality that is presented to them today. That's how an Uber was born, that's how a Paytm was born. It's just somebody who's fundamentally looking at disrupting an established order. So you can't take that away. That innovation and all of the benefits that come out of it come from that mindset of trying to disrupt something that's established. Therefore, if you look at the best way to support that, is that by definition somebody who comes up with an idea like that would be young, would not have the worldly wisdom of running businesses, get scars on your back by fighting battles, etc. Because by that time, the tyranny of reasonability sets in. You want to be reasonable, and therefore the tyranny of reasonableness sets in. Only those who have never tested a battle before come up with this completely disruptive idea. So I think the best solution that we have seen in the world is marry that very powerful idea, that very powerful team, or that very innovative disruptor with some adult supervision. Letting an entrepreneur whose entire DNA, entire idea is to come and change everything that's available in front of them, loose is also a problem. And like for example, an Eric Schmidt was bought in to, in that sense, bring adult supervision to Larry and Sergey. I think that's probably the best way to balance that there. Either end is actually wrong. You need something somewhere in between.
No, I generally agree with that. So I think, you have a sense from us that, look, broadly, we do see the need for balance between roles of boards and roles of CEOs. A lot of this is going to depend on the leadership shown by the independent chairman as envisaged under the Companies Act going forward. New generation companies are going to have to strike a balance between animal spirits and adult supervision. So this is very much a work in process as far as the Indian ecosystem is concerned. But I thought, as promised, we'd like to allow you to put some questions to us and allow enough time for that. So I'd, without further delay, immediately hand it over and say, please feel free to pose some questions and I'll direct them accordingly.
This is also, I wanted to say this about the next thing on the board committees also. Some of us who are independent directors, there is a dilemma because they say that you are getting too much into operations. Or they say that, you are to do only policy. So we really don't know how to have this thin line between policy and operations. And the point of making the independent directors very effective, the evaluation that is there, in fact, Mr. Damodaran will know about this entire evaluation of the independent directors is also really very, very cursory. So is there something that we could do to make these evaluations and other things more effective?
May I ask you on the point on the committee roles?
Yeah, I think as far as committee is concerned, especially Audit Committee and NRC, the larger part of the role appears to be monitoring and not just oversight, but a fairly close oversight, aided and supported by people like the auditors and internal auditors. Whereas NRC has got a slightly different role, but none of these committees really get into operations, to my mind. I have not experienced that anywhere, that we have to get into operations. But if we are going to certify the related party transactions, you come to know of operations, but you don't interfere. You don't tell the management unless you find that there is something wrong, not to do that or do that. So operations, to my mind, quite frankly, if defined or understood correctly, whether it is market-related, supply chain-related, value chain, market share, incentives, discounts, a lot of boards do get involved in that also, which is unfortunate to my mind, or the committees. There are committees like Risk Committee. Now there they bring in a third party, neutral, outside observation about the risk, which perhaps the involvement of the management is little difficult to see some of those risks. Or in their enthusiasm, in their zeal to perform, they miss out on some of those elements. And that is where I think committees do play an oversight role very effectively. That was the second was about...
I think you answered that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's, and at one, on this operations issue, I agree completely with Subodh on where the separation is. The one sector where we do have a serious problem, in my personal experience, is the financial sector, where one of the few countries in the world where board members are actually by design involved in making decisions on transactions. So for example, if you're on a bank board, you're actually approving transactions, not policies. You actually have credit processes and approvals coming to you at a transaction level, and typically the credit committees of the banks, which includes non-executive directors in addition to executive directors, is signing off on a virtually weekly basis on transactions. And this is because of the process by which we regulate banks and the design the RBI has put in place and so on. And it is a terrible anomaly. In fact, I would say it's a farce to have such a system. It's farcical partly because the management is in effect then passing upwards, if you like, responsibility for transaction level approvals. The board is superficially being involved in an activity which it has actually had very little application of mind on. And it's unclear that this is actually helping the interests of the institution. So one of the things which I think all of us, or I think I'd request Mr. Damodharan, in fact, as well, to use his platform to question and to further refine is this model we have in our financial system. And this applies to some of our other PSU-led insurance companies and so on as well. I see Thomas there. It is completely the wrong architecture to have the board get involved in making transaction-level decisions. And we are the only country which continues to place that burden on the board, and I think it is very unhealthy. And I just wanted to call that out.
I was also asking about the evaluation of the
Yeah.
directors. How do you make that?
Yeah. If I can.
Yeah.
I think, again, we have to go with our Indian culture. We haven't taken even, forget about board, in our own executive team, a feedback session, an honest feedback session is missing. We have yet not learned how to ask somebody to exit, both, in the corporate entity or the board. And I think this has to go over a period. The NRCs have to learn how to evaluate, but more important is then, and perhaps that's where a non-executive independent chair comes in,
Yeah.
who could give an honest feedback based on NRC's assessment and his own assessment. The moment it's a somehow directly or indirectly related board, the chemistry of giving a genuine assessment and its feedback is a difficult process. And we have to go through coming years to evolve that process to become more mature. Whether you are evaluating chairman or you are evaluating board or committees, I think all this is work in progress. We are nowhere near where we should be. But before all that, we must be culturally clear. How will we use that honest assessment? Are we ready to do that? I suppose will take us time.
I just want to add to the point which Mr. Bhargav made. In our own experience, we always consider all feedback as a gift. And in our experience, what we believe worked best for us is to have an independent agency do the evaluation. All board members give feedback about everybody. So it's almost like a self-regulatory mechanism where everybody gives feedback on everybody else. Then that gets sort of collated together by the independent agency to make sense, to draw right patterns and so on and so forth there. First previewed to the chairman of the board and the chairman of the nominations committee. So they also then weigh in and say, okay, maybe something was misunderstood or something or the other. But then finally actually goes as a written document to each board member that this is what all your colleagues think of you. And that instrument and that mechanism makes it a little bit more easier. Firstly, to make sure that there is fairness, there's no bias, etc., etc. And also then there's an obligation on the recipient of that feedback to come back and say, yes, okay, I got this feedback, I will change and be more participative or less participative. I know I was too distracted in the last board meeting, I'll switch off my phone. Whatever was the issue then also gets addressed because it's formalized through written feedback back to the individual.
It is said that...
yeah, Thomas, please.
It's said that the corporate governance depends on the personality of the chairman. And Mr. Puri, you took some names also. In the beginning, you mentioned that it would be a good idea to create a cadre of non-executive chairman. Is it feasible? How would it work? And does such a system exist in other countries or other markets?
Actually, my thought was less about a formal cadre where people are designated as non-executive chairman in waiting, as it were, but more a culture which would allow more such people to evolve. So, for example, I was saying quite simplistically, that Mr. Kamath could also have been a very successful non-executive chairman as he was at Infosys, as he showed, in my view. Mr. Deepak Parekh could be a very successful non-executive chairman in a number of other institutions other than HDFC, and Mr. A.M. Naik could be a very successful non-executive chairman in places other than NLT, or as indeed may Mr. Yogi Deveshwar outside of ITC and so on. But my point was more to illustrate that typically where we've had very successful CEOs who built a lot of value for their companies, and wearing an institutional investor hat, I also acknowledge that, by the way, institutional investors don't have a problem with strong CEOs becoming chairman, because in their mind, frankly, it safeguards value creation. If you look at the resolutions that get proposed, typically, they are passed. And these are all taken to shareholders and they are supported by shareholders. So all of these people I mentioned, and I like to use case examples because unless you do, people don't understand the point. I'm not using them to make judgments about people. I'm using them to bring some color and texture to the conversation. Institutional investors will say it's absolutely the right thing because, thank God, if, let's say tomorrow, if Aditya Puri becomes the chairman of HDFC Bank, it will be widely welcomed amongst institutional investors, because one of the big concerns they have is succession and after him, who, and so on. Separate problem that it indicates and challenges around succession planning. Yeah. But from a board process, board governance, board evolution point of view, it's actually constraining the development of what I would believe is good board processes and culture. Because you're actually continuing to have over-reliance on personalities and individuals, and actually you're dwarfing the relevance of the rest of the board. But and my point is, in the rest of the world, what you have seen is a phenomenon where if I have been very successful in company A and I have established a reputation for being a good leader, it would be logical for me to be viewed as a candidate for board membership and chairmanship or whatever of other institutions. It would be much more natural for people to take me in that role. And here, partly because of this slightly feudal culture, partly maybe because of corporate rivalry, partly because of the whole zamindari concept, that we have, we tend not to have encouraged that. And so we're slowing down the development of what I think is going to be a very important feature of governance in the future, which is people who are recognized as role models for having been successful independent chairmen. People who know how to support the board without getting over-involved, who will give space to the CEO to operate effectively, who will understand the difference between the role that the board will play while being supportive to the management, the adult supervision that Rostow talked about. And I just put that there as saying it's a concern, because in 2 years from now, we are apparently going to have a demand for large numbers of such people, and we should start debating how we are going to get there.
If I can just add a word in this, I don't think there is a connotation in what we are saying that the ex-CEO or ex-executive chairman should move away totally. No. I think it's a structure of the board and the new leadership which must get the space. The ex-chairman and ex-CEO is very welcome to be the coach or the mentor to the new CEO, if that is what is required because of his continuity, knowledge, wisdom. But the especially listed companies or even otherwise growing companies, giving space to the new team, to my mind, is most important.
One minor comment. Somehow I have this very deep discomfort with trying to create a cadre of anything. And at the risk of actually getting disinherited and disinvited by Mr. Damodaran from any future events, just look at places where we have created cadres, and I'm just using this only to illustrate my point. Look at the IAS, IFS, IPS. Any of those cadres don't produce uniform quality. You have some really brilliant IAS officers and some really unqualified IAS officers. So I'm very uncomfortable creating a cadre of anybody. I think it's each individual, the experiences that they go through, their attitude, their culture, all of those that define people who are effective in some roles and are not effective in some roles. But I think trying to create a cadre of people who can potentially be good chairmen, I think is a recipe for disaster, to be honest.
Yeah, it has to be more organic, much more organic.
Correct.
I belong to the IAS, but I will not take up the point of Rostow. But this is a follow-up to the issue of assessing independent directors and their role. My own impression is that it really depends upon the culture of the company. And there are two cultural stools, really, as it were. One is that of conformity, where largely the board is expected to follow whatever tone and content is set, as mentioned by Subodhji. And the other is the inquiring tone, which Rostow has spoken, especially in the new generation companies. And my own impression is that independent directors fall between the two stools, because when it's a question of questioning something in a culture-oriented issue of conformity, they are regarded as troublemakers. And when it comes to the new generation companies, anything less is not expected. Would the panel like to react to that, as to how cultures can be forged in this context?
That's what you wanted.
Okay, absolutely right, Mr. Jairaj. The organizational culture plays a big part in self-selecting board members who are in some ways aligned to that culture. So if the organization is a very conformity-oriented culture, then you'll also self-select board members who abide by it there. But I think to that point that Mr. Bhargav and Mr. Puri made before, there big role belongs to the chairman, who intentionally brings people who think slightly differently. I think that whole role that you need for boards to be somebody who speaks truths to power, I think is important. So therefore, it's the role of the chairman to ensure that everybody in the board does not think the same way. Whether it is the disaster that we saw in the Space Shuttle Challenger, groupthink is a very powerful evil force. So how does the chairman ensure that there is diversity of thought in the board is very critical. I think we only pay lip service to diversity in some of the visually identifiable parameters like ethnicity or gender, etc., etc. But I think the chairman needs to invest his or her time to ensure that there is diversity of thought in the board.
Just one. My question is, who creates the culture of the organization? The promoter, the CEO, and I think as we evolve, boards have a role and responsibility to create a culture which facilitates good corporate governance and well-being of the institution. And I think boards have a very important role to play there. It was said in the morning due diligence before you join the board. I think that's very fair. But then due diligence, if does not result in total discomfort, I will join the board and try to evolve with the group thinking, a change of the requisite culture, if that is the only issue in due diligence. But if in due diligence there's a different type of discomfort, that's a different issue. And I think boards will play that effective role of changing the culture, including in terms of the assessment of the board itself, etc.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Aditya here from Geo Payments Bank. There is enough written about the roles and responsibility of independent directors. In the Companies Act, there's a separate code for independent directors. There's a separate section on the duties of directors, and there is enough codification as to the roles and responsibilities of the key managerial personnel. Banking Regulation Act also lays a lot of emphasis on the role of a chairman, so much so that the chairman, either full-time or part-time, requires the approval of the RBI prior to appointment. However, there is not much written about as to what is the ideal role of a chairman, because it is largely left to the boards to decide as to what will be the role of a chairman. So I request the panel's guidance or the views as to whether it should be codified in the form of some guidance circular, or it should be left for the boards to decide. Secondly, based on the law that is to come, which is basically separation of office of the chairman and the managing director, like what we have seen in the past, increasingly we may see a number of promoters being elevated to the position of chairman emeritus. Again, there is not much written about the role of a chairman emeritus, because in most cases they remain present at board meetings, though they don't have a voting power. So should there be something codified as to their roles as well, is what I request the views of the panelists. Thank you.
I'll ask Subodh to answer that, but just a couple of factual
I thought
clarifications.
you know banking more,
and
it's all related to banking, so why don't you?
No, it's a broader question. I'll give you a quick, you see, the answer is, no country has codified, if you like, the role of a chairman, because for the simple reason that under the Cadbury Convention, and what you can broadly call the British Code of Corporate Governance, a chairman is essentially primus inter pares amongst directors. So the role of a chairman is, if you like, encapsulated in the role that directors, the formal roles, duties, fiduciary responsibilities, and so on of a chairman are no different to that of the director. But what there is, as a primus inter pares, the responsibility for essentially guiding your group of colleagues and peers and providing that leadership to the board is the only additional function that a chairman plays. But very importantly, that helps set the tone for the way the board will function, the collegiality within the board, issues around feedback and evaluation. So a chairman is very important in terms of the softer dimensions of the way a board works, even though he or she may play a virtually no additional role in the hardwired dimensions which the Companies Act calls for. And I think that's the right way, by the way, because when you have a group of peers sitting around a table and who are intended by design to be peers, then hardwiring a separate role or a hierarchical role for a chairman would actually be counterproductive. And the best role models, the best chairmen have essentially been people who have used their influencing ability as opposed to constitutional authority to actually guide the board. And this is true right across the world. On the issue of the RBI and banks and so on, as I've said earlier, we have an anomaly in this country in the way that financial sector boards and bank boards in particular engage on operational issues vis-a-vis the management. And I think that's unhealthy. And I think that's something that needs to be urgently addressed. And in fact, lies is one of the reasons why we have such systemic confusion in the way we govern our financial institutions. So I see that as a problem. But otherwise, it's simply saying that if you're a regulatory body, and I think this is appropriate, key officers should be deemed to be fit and proper. And if all the RBI is doing is exercising its judgment on a fit and proper criteria for the appointment of a CEO or chairman, then that is not an unusual practice. That is in fact normal for any regulated entity anywhere in the world, whether it is insurance or banking or telecom for that matter in many countries as well. So I don't think that's a problem.
Mr. Damodar.
Yeah.
Sorry, one minor comment to the point Mr. Puri made. As an operating manager, for heaven's sake, please don't add any more regulations on top of our heads almost. Then you'll come back and say that the chairman has to be 8 feet tall and has to have 3 horns and 4 eggs and 5 hands and all of that there. Actually, the business is struggling with the regulations that we have as well. But also on a serious note, I think we have to recognize that you can't legislate common sense. At the end of the day, entities, if they run well with a focus on customers, focus on people, focus on doing that's good for their business, etc., I think they'll evolve, to find good chairmen and good ways to manage themselves as well.
Just one quick comment before I come to Mr. Damodaran. I mean, on the role of the chair. I think this relates to a point which came up earlier, that what we've had recently in India is this phenomenon where everybody leaves the room when there's a crisis. I think to me that exemplifies the lack of leadership or the leadership vacuum that exists in some of our boardrooms. Because as an institutional investor or minority investor, it's precisely at that point in time that you want to see the exercise of leadership, not an abdication of leadership. And without judging individuals, because I think as Anand Mahindra pointed out for those of you who were in the plenary, and I think he's right, he took a very sympathetic view on this and he said, obviously they're going to leave the room. Because what do you expect them to do in our system? They're not going to hang around and wait to be roasted over the fire, so it's logical for them to leave. But it throws up a very worrying scenario for us, that on the one hand, we've created this architecture which says, and it shouldn't be a fiction, it should be real, that the board is expected ultimately to be the final arbiter and custodian of the safety and well-being of the company. The moment there's a crisis, everybody seems to be heading for the hills. So the institutional mechanism you have set up for safeguarding and providing that custodianship breaks down at the first test. We all understand why, and we are sympathetic to the fact that it breaks down, which shows how inured we've become and how low our expectations are of actually seeing good governance delivered. Because we've all accepted it. We actually think it's a logical thing to do. So it speaks very poorly of where we are in terms of the maturity of our governance model. If at the precise, most extreme point of need, our boards are unable to actually cohere and hold together and leadership disappears. But I don't have an answer to that, but it just strikes me as deeply worrying. Mr. Damodaran?
You mentioned some time ago that 2 years from now, in fact, a little under 2 years from now, you'll need a lot of non-executive chairpersons to lead boards. There's a huge problem, and it's not a problem of availability of persons. It is whether these persons have what it takes to lead the boards. Because there is an assumption that anyone who is appointed chairman from day one knows how to lead a board. And that's a huge problem, what lawyers call a rebuttable presumption, and it can be rebutted very easily. You mentioned cadres. I mean, once upon a time, I too belonged to a cadre, but I'm not a great believer in cadres. But if you look at public schools in northern India, the leading public schools in northern India, you will find about 5 or 6 principals, headmasters, whatever, who've moved from one school to the other. That universe of selection is just those 6 or 7. I happened to ask one of them, why do you get these same people? Tried and tested. He said, yeah, you answered the question. Tried and tested. We don't want to experiment and fail with a bunch of children. One last comment that I wanted to make. When you move away from, when you move a person from a CEO's role to a chairman's role, you're lucky. KK is an exception. But you normally have this business of, the Indian phenomenon. Nothing succeeds like successor. So what happened is you're trying to prove that guy didn't get it right. I have to change the whole thing to prove that I'm better. Now, if that guy is still around in your boardroom and in a position as chairman, you've created the ideal situation for a problem and the company will pay the price.
take one last question if anyone has one. Yeah.
I would just, I'm Vishal Javeri. I would like to address this to Mr. Leo Puri. The international laws, I would just like to bring to your notice that on all these topics, for example, the separation of CEO and chair. So the UK Combined Code of Corporate Governance, which was formulated on the basis of the recommendations of the Cadbury Committee report, it does provide that the CEO and the chair should be separate. Clearly. At the same time, it provides, it balances, it says that the intent of this legislation is that there should be a balance in the board. And alternatively, it also provides a facility whereby where the CEO and the chair is combined, there should be a lead independent director on the board to balance out this particular provision. And when a company opts to do this, it should make justifications while reporting. Secondly, as far as the responsibilities are concerned, the board of directors vis-a-vis the CEO and the executive management, the UK Combined Code requires that there should be a board charter which should be company specific, not a one-size-fits-all. And the board charter should specifically state that what should be the responsibilities of the executive management and the CEO, the expectations of the board from the CEO, the role that the CEO would play in the board, and the information flow and the details flow from the CEO and the board and vis-a-vis. So, and as far as evaluation of directors is concerned, the UK code requires that at least once in 3 years, there should be an independent evaluation by an external agency. So, sir, do you think it's the time to benchmark the Indian code with this law?
Well, so the short answer is actually I think India's corporate governance has, by and large, benchmarked itself. And we have exactly the same provisions with what now looks like one exception. It would appear that we've made a decision, unless there's a change of heart on the government or MCA's point of view, that we will not leave open the option between a unified chair and CEO and lead independent director model. We appear now to have closed that. My personal view was you could have made that model work. If you do have a model where you have a unified role of chairman and CEO and you have a strong independent director, I mean, there are the US, of course, is full of good examples where that has worked. But we have now made the decision, post the Kotak Committee and the MCA's response to that, that we are going to separate those rules. So this notion of the lead independent director will probably not have much space in India's corporate governance in the future. On all the other points, actually all good boards do have board charters. They define the role of the committees. They lay out the tasks of the committees. They lay out the role of the information that is to be provided to boards. But as always, you need to go beyond that to the tone, texture, and quality of discussions that take place. And that can never be legislated. That will always depend on the quality of people in the room, the leadership that is provided to those people, and frankly, the mutual trust which they develop between each other. And good boards have all that, and I think there are examples of that. So I'm hoping that is the direction where governance in India will go in the future. But I'd like to thank Mr. Bhargav and Mr. Ravanan, and thank all of you for your contribution and participation. So with that, I guess it's time for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Puri. If I could request Mr. Thomas Matthew to please come up and present tokens to all our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, you have about 45 minutes for lunch, and we hope that we can see all of you inside the hall at 2:15, where we have a little game that we play before we go into the serious session.
Even as you leave the hall, just bear with me for 30 seconds. The first session post-lunch will feature Yezdi Malegam, who is the Bhishma Pitamaha of the auditing profession. Don't miss it. I guarantee you, if you miss it, you'll regret it.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure that you take care of the bags that you have, and it doesn't get mistakenly picked up by somebody else. So just personalize your bag as much as you can so that you can find it when you come back. Thank you.